Talk shoes. Recorded live.
Good evening. Welcome to the Saturday, February the 24th, 2018 edition of Daily Talk, Researcher 135's Community Call, with your host, Rich Vernadeau. This evening we have as our guest, Dan Sullivan, Director of Saving. Good evening. Good evening, Dan. I'm going to tell the folks a little about you, and then you can, of course, go ahead and elaborate. So you're the Director of Saving Communities and President of the Council of Georgia's organization. It's named after Henry George, the leading progressive economist of the 19th century. Tell us a little about that, if you would, Dan.
Well, Henry George took an idea that the classical liberals had all promoted. And the people who call themselves classical liberals today tend to not embrace this. But they said, you know, free enterprise is great. Everyone should be entitled to the fruits of their labor. But when you appropriate the earth for yourself, you owe something back to the community. So what John Locke and Adam Smith and Francois Quesnay and John Stuart Mill and a bunch of those people advocated was that you should be taxed on the value of the land that you've appropriated for yourself, and you should be charged royalties on the natural resources you consume. And today we would say you should not only be taxed on the good things you take out of the earth, but the bad things you put in. So today we say there should also be taxes on noxious emissions. So that proposal is that those taxes, except for little user fee things, that basically those taxes would fund a reasonably efficient government. And this was the classical liberals downplayed, the European classical liberals downplayed this a bit because there was no democracy at that time, so they were writing this to the landlords and suggesting that it's in their interest to pay it. But the American classical liberals, Tom Paine, Jefferson, Franklin, William Penn is actually not an American, but he was so defiant that he had the attitude that the American classical liberals had. They all said that you should tax the value of land. So that's where it began, and Henry George made it a major political movement, largely because Henry George came along just as the frontier was closing. And so American wages were 3 or 4 times as high as European wages, which is one of the reasons so many people say that they fled Europe for religious freedom and things like that, but mostly they came here because the opportunity to make a decent living was so much higher here, because where rents are not taking so much of the wealth, they go to wages and capital. And
Dan, I'd like to take a moment to welcome the caller to the show. Good evening, guest 3.
I guess that's me. Hi. Hi, Rich.
Hi,
Sherry.
Hello, how are you this evening, Terry? Would you like to ask Dan a question?
Well, I got in on, I just tuned in on the tail end of what he was talking about, so I'm just listening for now.
Well, he's talking to us about the development of the progressive era and particularly the classical liberal idea of preventing monopoly by taxing the value of land and natural resources. Tell me how it has its roots in the abolitionist movement, the progressive era, and how prominent politicians and socialists hijacked it over the years. Tell me what happened, Dan.
Okay, well, the hijacking came basically toward the end of the 1890s, and it was completely hijacked by the time Wilson's administration was in. But the original progressive movement, one of the things is the original progressive movement was not populated by people who call themselves progressives. The exception was that the Society of Progressive Friends, which was a Quaker abolitionist group in I think they began around 1830. They called for abolition, and they also called for homesteading rights and opposed big corporate land grabs. And I think they called for an income tax, which the progressives were divided on an income tax. But when you look at the Free Soil Party, which is prior to it's the largest of the parties that became the Republican Party. Their platform called for making all the land of the West available as homestead, and no more sales to large corporations of frontier land. When the Republicans took over, what happened is the Whigs, we had a situation where the monarchists lost, after the Revolutionary War, and the monarchists could not call themselves monarchists. So they called themselves Federalists, and when they became very unpopular, which didn't take too long, then they called themselves Whigs, and the Whig Party rose up out of the ashes of the Federalists. And then the Republican Party was officially formed out of a bunch of little parties, but what happened was a lot of disaffected Whigs joined the Republican Party. And the Whigs were dominated by bankers. One of the problems with abolition was that and this is something you don't hear about in the official story of how it was all the South's fault, is that most of the slaves were under mortgages, and the New York bankers particularly held the mortgages on those slaves. So there were never proposals from the North to abolish slavery by buying the slaves, because that would mean the whole country would be taxed, and the northern banks, which were making debt money, getting interest on debt off the slaves, would be harmed just as much as the southern plantation owners. So there's a bunch of things in that, but the big transition from the Free Soil Party platform to the Republican Party platform, which was done largely by the Whigs, was instead of a plank that said we'll give all the land to homesteaders, it said we're going to build a transcontinental railroad, and the transcontinental railroad will open up lands for the West. But what they ended up doing is giving so much land to the railroad itself that the actual homesteaders were not very well off. And the railroads, they gave I call it a zipper pattern, or checkerboard pattern. Along the railroad, you would have a 10-mile square on the right side of the railroad that was given to the railroad, and then a 10-mile square on the left side of the railroad that was given to the railroad. And the notion was that the homesteaders could take the alternate squares. But what they ignored or concealed was that it doesn't do you any good to be along a railroad track. It only does you good to be along near a terminal. So the railroad companies would buy up that little bit of land so they'd have both sides of the tracks where the terminal was. And they got massive amounts of land for that. And so that's one of the great monopolies that was laid, the groundwork was laid even before the Civil War. But the Civil War ended up creating a whole bunch of war debts, and the South was made to pay the North's debts or to share in the North's debts, and the South's debts were abolished and all kind of stuff. But there was all sorts of turmoil that the abolitionists themselves found after the war. They were grateful that the slavery had been abolished, but they saw a great deal of abuse in that and broke away from the Republican Party to form. There was the Greenback Labor Party. There were a number of small parties that rose again, and they also fought within the Democratic and Republican parties. But they were trying to address fundamental questions of fairness. And because they came out of the abolitionist movement, their approach to everything was, well, if there's an injustice, there must be an underlying privilege. And why don't we just abolish the privilege?
Mm-hmm.
So the way to abolish the privilege is to put a tax on the value of land, the way the classical liberals have advocated. They opposed patent rights. They opposed banks and said government should create all the money. And
Dan, I would like to take a moment, hold that thought. I would like to take a moment to welcome another caller. Good evening, Northeast Texas.
Good evening. Am I on the air?
You are. Do
Yep.
you have a question or a comment for Dan Sullivan?
No, I'm very interested in what he's saying. I'm learning some things.
Okay, he's going to tell us more. Go ahead, Dan, with how polarizers began to dominate both parties, and especially dominating minor parties. Tell us a little about the polarization.
Okay, well, the polarization, the progressives especially were attacked by the right as being anti-capitalist, which they were not, and they were attacked by the left for not being anti-capitalist. And this is one of the things that we have, when you look at the word capitalism, the socialists have a definition of capital that is completely different from what the classical liberals had. So to the classical liberals, there was land, labor, and capital. And so what happens is land exists, labor works on that land and produces wealth. And you can produce wealth far more efficiently if you make tools. So instead of planting with a stick, you can make a plow, and that in the short run, you're not producing any wealth because you can't eat the plow. But in the long run, after a year or two, you have so much more food because you used the plow than you had if you had stuck with the more primitive way of doing it. So the plow is capital. I mean, that's the simplest thing, is that the plow is capital, and the fact that you're growing food and storing it for the future makes the food capital too, to the classical liberals. So before there was capital, we just, we were hunters and gatherers, and we foraged for food. And there was no private ownership of land, and there was no capital. There was you just lived hand to mouth. So the idea is that the advent of capital is a good thing, but the private ownership of land is only a good thing if it's in the hands of users. So American Indians did plant. They didn't have plows, but they did plant. And the land was considered yours for the harvest season. Jefferson writes about this, and some other people have too, that the American Indians said, well, if an Indian family plants a field, that field is theirs until harvest season. Then after the harvest, anybody can use that land. And because they didn't have fertilizer and, they didn't have crop rotation and all that stuff, they just plowed a field, and then they just planted a field, and then they would go plant a different field. They usually burned out the old weeds, and then they planted a different field. And so they didn't have a problem, perpetual property in land, but you did own land as an adjunct because you owned the fruits of your labor, which was the plants you had planted. And when you get right down to it, the classical liberals, the reason classical liberalism began in England and France is that they were getting information from their colonies. England and France had the only real colonies where we settled among the Indians. Spain had colonies of sorts, but they found gold, and as soon as they found gold, they just went nuts for the gold and went about enslaving Indians to make them mine the gold for them. So there was less of an interaction in South and Central America than there was here, and we we basically learned a lot about government from the American Indians. They had very little government, and they had principles of fairness, which is necessary. You know, one of the good things about anarchism is that the less government power you have, the fairer you have to be. You know, the bad thing about anarchism is if you have no governmental power at all, people from the outside can just run roughshod over you because they have organized power and you don't. So what the American liberals, their approach was, we want to have enough government to keep out other governments, and we want to have enough government to enforce a system of fairness so people can't ride roughshod over each other.
Dan, you were once the county chair of the Allegheny County Greater Pittsburgh Greens and the Allegheny County Libertarian Party. Could you tell us a little bit about the Libertarian Party?
Sure. Well, it wasn't at the same time. I was chair of the Allegheny County Greens. The original Greens were pretty libertarian in themselves. They were very environmentally conscious, but they were against central government and stuff. And they basically got hijacked by environmental socialists, and that came along with forming the Green Party. The original Greens in America didn't really want to form a party. They thought that they could work more effectively through the major parties. But the libertarians have that minimal government thing, but there's either the dominant, I'd say not necessarily the majority, but the most vocal faction of the libertarians want absolute unlimited property and land. And so they don't want any taxes at all. They want the landlords to fund everything, which means the landlords control everything, which takes us right back to feudalism, because feudalism was the landlords owned all the land. They didn't originally own it. They were originally, under common law, a landlord was just a great person. When you had a land dispute, you went to a landlord because he was thought of as a wise person with regard to land. If you saw Vikings on the horizon, you ran to the warlord because he was the person who was wise with regard to how we're going to fight the Vikings. So the landlords very gradually became landowners in Europe, and they had total control because there was no democracy. And what the far right of the libertarians are like is very much what they're advocating is very much like feudalism. So I have problems with both the Greens and the libertarians, but I think the Greens are more hopeless in the sense that they are more thoroughly taken over by the authoritarian left, and the libertarians are still struggling with the authoritarian right. There's bad influences in the Libertarian Party, but there's good aspects of it as well. And one of the best aspects of it is that they honor disagreement. So if you're in a group in the left and you challenge them on things, you find yourself quickly marginalized and pushed aside. But when you challenge libertarians, you become the center of attention because libertarians love to argue. Now, it makes them terribly ineffective at organizing, but it makes them more open to conflicting ideas.
On that note, Dan, I would like to ask you about something that you focused upon, how the tactics used by both left and right play into the hands of centralized power. Elaborate a little bit on that point.